Well, welcome back to another edition of Voices of Video. And this is a great time of year because there is so much new news coming out around IBC. We're getting to the middle of the year. Everybody is making their announcements. There's a lot of just super exciting things happening in the industry. And as usual on Voices of Video, we bring you interviews with the people who are making it happen. And so today I am talking to Ray Panahon, who recently joined i3D. And, Ray, first of all, I want to welcome you to Voices of Video. And hey, congratulations on your new role at i3D.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. It's great to be over on this side of the pond.
Yeah, it's great to, it's great to have you. i3D is an important partner of ours, of NetInts and the VPU ecosystem. And, maybe we should start with just a real quick, what is your role and what are you doing at i3D? And then I know we've got some very interesting discussion threads, to unpack.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm currently the Director of Solutions Engineering, managing our engineering practice, solutions architects, also responsible for security and RIT.
Awesome. Well, that's an important role. So we've had Stefan on, and i3D is not completely unknown to listeners of the pod, but maybe you could give just a 1 minute. I never assume that everybody has heard all of our, all of our interviews. So there's probably somebody who's like, i3D, I don't think I'm familiar. So give the 1 minute, who is i3D? What do you guys do? And, why are you here talking, to me today?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, i3d.net. Definitely not working with 3D content, right? And I thought it was a kind of a strange connection, but the company's been, around for over 2 decades. The best way I could put the company is private cloud, European owned, European data centers, global presence. Right. And the company's built this top 5 peered network in the world. That was kind of the thing that got me at most because I didn't know. You're talking of top 5 and you're thinking major ISPs, and yet there's i3D with their own private backbone, managing 64% of the traffic, all peered across the globe, all low latency. And, it's really built for gaming and low latency live distribution. Environments. And I've joined here because the company's had this really consistent success in delivering games, right, for a number of different publishers around the globe. And the tides have started to turn where companies started to get a lot of inquiries about serving other verticals and being able to, augment cloud strategies, whether it's hybrid or, BCP related or DR related. And i3D is starting to see this really great opportunity to serve as this private cloud provider for folks outside of the gaming space.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you said a key word there, the tide has turned. It was only, 5-6 years ago, which in technology feels like a lifetime, but, it's not that long ago. There were still networks that were like, we've architected our video platform for VOD. File-based, and go to this, other network for live, and then go to this other network for gaming. And, there were all these little silos, right? And a lot of that was just the state of the technologies. But now the network is just becoming real time. And, we're seeing this even with, major VOD services, or actually now you can't even say because, the one I'm thinking of actually has live events and they have a gaming platform. And what's remarkable is this is being served largely from the same CDN, which again, 5, 6, 7 years ago, people have said, oh, that's not possible. They can never do that. Well, yeah. They are. Yeah. So, yeah.
It's an interesting transformation because my past, working at these larger sort of entertainment and gaming companies where you have this challenge of trying to deliver consistent experience, consistent content globally and at scale, trying to reach as much eyeballs as possible, right? To do that, you need the ability to scale outside of just one vendor, right? And it's great if you could do it with one, but I think realistically, if you're going to get to all of your fans and all of your user base, it's being able to get your content and your experience out there, as far and as wide as possible.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, you are in Europe, and data sovereignty is a topic that, everybody's talking about. Of course, we don't get political on this show, but it's very well known that the EU is very concerned, and yeah, personally, I believe rightfully so, in controlling, how data flows, who has access to data. Countries, are taking different levels of perspectives, but across the EU, I think really all countries are starting to say, hey, if you're going to deliver content, to our citizens in our country, you need to do that from infrastructure that is owned and controlled within our country. In a lot of ways, it just sort of makes sense, right? Now, that's difficult because the internet is a global resource. And by definition, you can be delivering content from halfway around the world, So I'm curious, what i3d.net is seeing, if there's an opportunity there. And really where I think our listeners would be interested to understand is, what does this mean for, I don't know, a US distributor who might be wanting to stream and deliver content into the
Yeah.
EU?
Yeah.
What should they be thinking about? How do you make sense of all of this whole sovereignty?
It's a great point, because going back to the what you talked about, 5 years, right? I mean, just in the last 18 months, right? What's really changed in EU is NIS2 and DORA, right? Moved from like this draft to enforcement across the, for the EU Data Act, right? And now there's like this switching and portability pressure, right? And board level needs to de-risk and mitigate, right? And now this has become a compliance line across the board, right? And so it's not something that it's great for i3D because it opens up a lot of opportunities, but it also adds a different level of complexity now that content distributors and production companies need to adhere by. So it's just, we're seeing variations of those types of things like NAS2 now emerge in standards, and, which we'll see in France and other countries, and so forth. For us, I'd say that with i3D, we've focused on being sort of this like white glove, but hands-on company for folks that need to deliver content. In a lot of cases, it's always been games, but now sort of that business need is widened because of NIS2 and DORA, right? For us particularly. So it's put a lot of focus on ways for us to, make some adjustments to be able to help content owners and, producers be able to meet that compliance line and, fit their workloads in our.
Yeah. So architecturally, walk us through, what does this look like? So is it as simple as i3D, would operate on behalf of a service, the encoding and delivery infrastructure, the CDN, encoding in country, et cetera. In other words, all of the video processing that i3D would be able to validate, yes, there's no streams that are being delivered, or there's, again, I know it depends on the content. It's not that, something can't come from outside the country, but, so it's content dependent. But what does that actually look like architecturally when you talk about the sovereign video cloud, which we're starting to see some announcements, from other vendors that are partnering and saying, hey, we have a sovereign video cloud. What does that really mean?
Yeah. So I think for us, I'm really excited because of where we're taking sort of our product roadmap and our capability to support various kind of workloads. So architecturally, just going back a bit, like when we talk about i3d.net as a private cloud provider, we do a lot of the basic thing: connectivity, co-location, here's a rack, right? Or we can provide you with straight bare metal, compute with GPUs, and fast storage. And then, over time, we added a virtualization layer on top of that. So you can, get more out of bare metal by minimizing sort of your compute workloads. Well, one of our, latest iterations is now throwing like managed Kubernetes on top of, all of these environments, whether it's bare metal or we call like Flex VM, where it's virtualized, and then now managed Kubernetes. And why I'm excited about that is because, I know NetInt ships out a Kubernetes device plugin, right? That's available out there. And, hypothetically, you could look at the fact of us supporting these Quadra clusters and a provider coming in and say, hey, i3D, we need to do a 2-month event in Sao Paulo, or we need to do something in, Singapore and Malaysia, right? And it's very intentful sort of workloads and distribution for things that augment scale, right? And, some of the other sort of content providers that we're working with that I can't name are sort of facing this challenge of like, hey, we use A, B, and C, but we also need an option D, E, and F, right? And we need to leverage economy of scales and obviously maximize our own margins as well, right? So it's a really nice problem and challenge to have right now because this newest thing that we're doing with managed Kubernetes allows us to really kind of widen our approach to work with different ISVs, especially in content distribution and streaming, and leveraging things like, NetEnt's Quadra.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you commercialize your network? I've noticed obviously infrastructure as a service has been, kind of an acronym and a thing for years, but now, I'm starting to look at, it's almost like everybody's platform is basically infrastructure as a service where you can literally buy it at just the bare metal. Like, give me a server and, give me access to it. And then there's sort of the VM level above that, and you mentioned like your Kubernetes and then there's some like AWSs, which of course have then built, all kinds of software and microservices and, you kind of building blocks, if you will. So where is i3d.net in kind of that whole, architecture stack in terms of how someone would use you,
Yeah, for sure. So traditionally, it hasn't really deviated as much from how i3D has managed catering to gaming industry, right? And it comes from a place where, we're coming across publishing companies and developers and companies that really want to like publish their game and do these for periods of time or their long-term, long-tail content. And what ends up happening is, we'll get usually asked different kinds of requirements around what they want to do, right? And some game publishing companies we work with want the straight bare metal. They want access to the BIOS, which we can provide them remotely, and it's something we give them the capability. Some are like, hey, we're happy to use your Terraform and virtualization platform and work from that perspective, right? And it varies and it's become more and more flexible to now we're expanding into Kubernetes, right? So that hasn't changed. The audience has just gone a lot wider. In my short time here, what I found interesting is meeting people from financial industry that are looking to like mitigate risks on where they're located on the streaming side, surprisingly, and doing live content distribution, right? And then folks that do everything from games that were 5 or 6 years old that are still very, very like played a lot to mobile games, right? That are like really event based and are tied to like live events, right? If you will. So the way we've managed those relationships haven't really changed. It's just the audience has gone a lot wider.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, it's fascinating and so much opportunity, which leads me to, my next question. And I'm really curious to get your perspective. So many people are talking about repatriating off public cloud or, changing from kind of one architecture to another. Largely, I think it's cost based. There's just pricing pressure. There's operational costs. CFOs or especially for public companies are starting to wake up and go, wait a second, the cloud maybe isn't quite as great as we thought it was going to be from an operational cost perspective. And I'm speaking, I have to be careful when I say the cloud, because I'm speaking more from kind of your traditional public cloud where, the whole promise was, hey, get started here and your costs just scale as your usage. Well, that's exactly the problem. Your costs scale as your usage grows, and which means that by definition, there is kind of no ceiling that you reach. It just, you continue to spend more quarter after quarter. What are you seeing that the blockers are? Because we hear a lot, we're about to go into this major trade show, IBC. I can tell you that 4 out of 5, if not 5 out of 5 people who walk into the booth for a meeting, the meeting's going to start with some variation of, we have got to get off, fill in the blank public cloud. That's why I'm here to talk to you guys, And yet we know that as sincere as that request is, not 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5 are going to follow through with it. it's a much smaller number. And we have enough experience with this to kind of understand why. But I want to hear from you, why that is. Why do companies have this very sincere desire? They're going to send their engineering teams or engineering leaders, the CTO, the CFO is going to mandate, hey, gang, I need you to get to IBC and come back with solutions because, like we can't re-up. And yet so many people don't follow through.
Yeah.
What? Why?
Yeah, I think 5 years ago it was harder to make that business case, but now it's pretty overwhelming when you even try to look at it, and that's a case why it dies, right? And one thing that I see often is that no one really owns the layer beneath the application, and that's the things that you pay for that the hyperscalers kind of cover, right? And that's what it is, because cloud deleted a job, right, at the end of the day. And the person's infrastructure went away, and that was sold as a feature, right, back then.
That's
But
right.
now you kind of have these you get to gain these weirdly fluctuating costs, right? So
Yeah.
when you repatriate, you kind of have to create a function that was deliberately removed years
Yeah.
ago, right? And it's an org chart problem, fundamentally, that a lot of people look at. And the kind of that one vendor, one bill.
Yeah.
It comes with
One throat to choke,
right.
I always hated that saying, but that's that they did look at it that way.
Yeah, so you manage service, or you go with in our media space, you go with a media software vendor, silicon vendor, infrastructure provider, someone to integrate it all, right? And it's still there still comes with a lot of gotchas, right?
Yeah.
What I've found though is that the successes that we've seen time and time again for repatriation is folks that understand what they're trying to run and deliver, right? And things they need out of a partner to make that successful, right? So when you think about going back to the game side, a lot of the things that we get sent to us are like, hey, this is what this software application does. This is how many people we need it to reach. This is how many times we expect to update it. You guys take care of the rest. Right. And one big differentiating factor though for us is that at i3D, and I feel like is probably the number one reason why a lot of people choose i3D, is you could get a hold of a real person in 15 minutes, not your account manager or anything. And I think that there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah,
right?
there
Especially
is.
if you're smaller, like a lot of these lean and mean companies where nowadays where, you're one engineer that's probably doing 3 people's jobs, 4 people's
Yeah.
jobs. Those kind of relationships become more valuable than others, right?
Yeah.
So, I think about the challenge we have in our space though, like in live production, particularly,
Yeah.
that it's a real big challenge because there's no safe first step, right? You can't A/B test live streaming.
Yeah.
So you really need a
The
good
kickoff of the game,
yeah,
you
a good
better
tech
be working and that
partner,
stream better be up. There's
right,
no
right, and a good tech integrator, or broadcast integrator, and good cloud partner with engineers that are readily available to make sure things go off. And for us, it's something that I see continue that we provide daily. Just because I'm active in the Slack channels, I see what's going on. It's it's something that we're really proud about as a company.
Yeah, I mean that definitely resonates. We get very similar feedback. We meaning, NetInt with our VPU support, because it really is about that being able to get to a real live person who can in that moment, or if not in that moment, very quickly thereafter, get a resolution, handle the issue, fix the problem, help with that integration complexity, whatever the challenge is. It's not always stuff that's not working. In some cases, like, hey, we need to integrate with this and that and this other system, and we say, well, we can help you with the first 2 and we'll help you figure out the third, and that's so important. Yeah, it's interesting as much as I've been working in the video space, specifically streaming for, well, quite a while. This actually would be, I guess, my 20th year, technically. Hard to believe. On one hand, it's gone fast. But you think about how developed, the open source projects are, how, now you can just go out and buy solutions, which, even just, 7, 8, 10 years ago, you had to engineer and build, and now you can buy them. And what you can buy is quite good, actually very good in almost every case. And yet it hasn't made it any easier to deliver video reliably, right?
Right.
Isn't that amazing? And I know, you've been in the space too, working. So you've got a similar perspective. It's
Yeah, what's funny is like you're right. When you've seen the evolution of like live and remote production, over like the last 10 years, and even, I like to take credit for being a part of that, in esports and changing the game with respect to how Remy was looked at and doing this over MPEG-4, right? As like a real live production stream. And one thing I do note though is that fundamentally, when you do something as important as like producing a live event, there's always that level of like craft expertise and that belongs to humans. That is as much AI and as much robots there are. I think that there's this level of like craft expertise and artistic kind of like talent that is going to make it very hard to replicate, right? What I do like is, when you have these tools that can do a lot more, it does give more folks a lower barrier to entry to experience and learn how to do these things, right? Because one thing I would love to see is just like, yeah, more and more, you just have this pipeline of like younger talent that's coming in and learning how to produce shows and stream and reaching an audience. Obviously, people are doing that now through like TikTok and all these other things with these really, short form content. But I'm glad that there's the technology that allows people to be able to like reach audiences further. But to your point, like, yeah, you're talking about like high quality, high fidelity. You're still going to get what you pay for at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I saw an interesting statistic, which, doesn't surprise any of us if you are in the market trying to buy, hard drives or memory or servers, which obviously i3D buys a lot of all of those. But for kind of the first time, CDN costs are rising. Now they're not increasing by double digits every quarter or whatever, but it was, for years, it's just been, quarter over quarter declines. And, analysts like Dan Rayburn, put out their regular reports. And it's just like it was getting down to just fractions and fractions of a penny, per gigabyte transferred. And it's kind of like, wow, how much further can you slice the penny? Like it just the costs were, and all of a sudden, it's stabilizing and it's even, deals are kind of increasing a little bit, and yeah, I think largely that's because of just the sheer costs. Now, at some point you have to say, look, I can't keep cutting my costs when memory is 10x what it was 18 months ago.
Yeah, definitely. Supply chain pressures, we're feeling that everywhere, right?
Yeah.
No one's sort of immune. And
No one's immune. Yeah.
I also think that a lot of the traditional sort of like service providers in this space are competing against AI, right? So when we're talking about like transit, electricity, power, you go in and for us, when we're looking at, colo spaces and opening up new pops, we'll get a quote for things and, sometimes within the same week, the things get swallowed up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's like, wait a second. What do you
Yeah.
mean the price has gone up? You gave me the quote on Monday. And they're like, well, it's Wednesday.
Yeah.
You're like, what?
Yeah. So, and it's everything. It's everything from connectivity to metered pricing, committed pricing,
Yeah. Yeah.
the whole nine yards. And it's, and I see it just even affects things like CDN. And I can only imagine like what their sort of like logistics challenges are when you're having to do tech refresh and phase out of hardware.
Yeah. 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 For sure. For sure. Well, so you run the solutions engineering group, or you have an engineering team. Maybe it would be helpful to explain to the audience what you do and your team does at i3D to, really facilitate, because there is, we talked about some of the challenges with repatriation and, there are definitely companies that are moving. And just to be fair, there's people moving off public cloud. There's people moving on to clouds. There's people moving from privately owned infrastructure, their own data centers, to kind of a hybrid approach. So there's a lot of movement right now architecturally. What does your team actually do? Are you joining alongside your customer? Are you doing the work for them? Is this kind of a professional services org? Tell us the scope.
When you look at a company that's, less than 200, the answer is we do it all, right? I think I'm lucky because I run a team of veterans that have been in this vertical for, 20 years or so. right? And so they've touched a lot of different things over their careers. And the level of sort of duty is everything from, supporting our sales and our customers from like an advocacy perspective to what I look at as just like design challenges and trying to figure out like, what is a roadmap? Because one thing I'm very adamant about is not selling because I just don't think that's worth it. I think that for me, when you look at my career, I've sat on the other side of the desk where I had to work with a lot of vendors. And to me, the most valuable thing was finding strategic partners that always had great advice and were always forward thinking. So I try to do the same thing for all of our clients, and it's something that the team tries to do across the board. We had a conversation yesterday about a client that needed to do a tech refresh on Juniper routers. And, they didn't know that their thing was kind of like going end of life. And one of our guys just called it out and said, hey, like, you might want to know, like, this is a thing. But there's no skin in the game for us on that. But for us, it's us demonstrating that we really like care about.
Yeah, but it's being value add and and contributing and helping, doing what's best for the client, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the short time I've been there, what I've seen is, being a good partner just opens up a lot of different doors. Like fundamentally at the end of the day, and allows my team and myself to actually do what we love to do, which is solve problems, right? And, try to build for things in the future that help our customers reach a different level, where they're trying to go with their business. So for me, it's not only about fixing a problem. It's like, well, how do we get you better than where you were and what you're expecting? So there's a lot of different things we're doing in that space. I mean, one guy on my team is working on AI inference and Gen AI, with a gaming company, and another's working with a full repatriation off cloud, which is a massive project. And like these are awesome challenges to be working on and seeing at the forefront, because the lessons learned that we get to share after the fact is pretty amazing. Just what we get to share internally with the rest of the engineers and our product teams.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Well, I just love the diversity of solutions and vendors and partners that are all a part of the VPU ecosystem. And it's no secret. I mean, people can go on the website and, we freely publish all of our partners in the VPU ecosystem. There's other networks and platforms, but what you're describing is a different level of capability. It's a twist of what others bring. And I think it's so powerful because I say it a lot, and we really truly believe it in our core. Rising tides raise all boats. And the VPU is, the CPU. I mean, that was an absolute transformation, being able to run encoding software on commodity x86, commercial off the shelf servers. It's how many, many, many great platforms got started. So literally spinning up AWS instances and you could actually get started and you could do it affordably. And there were so many benefits, and then along came the GPU, and the GPU had its benefits, and then there was other attempts at dedicated silicon like FPGA. And we looked at all this 10 years ago now, 11 years ago, actually, and said, gee, there's a place for all of that, but there's also a place for a totally purpose-built video processing unit. Let's call it the VPU. And, these things will just sip energy. So, they'll be incredibly power performant, and, we'll be able to optimize around the video encoding function. And then out came the VPU. And, this is why our partnership with i3d.net is really important, not just to our two companies, but it's important to the industry. It really is. Ray, I think it'd be really interesting to end with, or wrap up with a couple things, couple questions that I have for you. You and I were talking, we crossed paths many years ago when you were, doing a lot of your work in Hollywood, and I was doing a lot with the studios, and, we were, talking about sort of the aha, of like, wow, i3D, like the video streaming services and platforms need to really understand who i3d.net is, because I know you're relatively new, and, you were telling me, off mic, like, yeah, even through the interview process, getting to know the company, I was shocked, like, wow, really? like, like the market needs to know about this. So tell us the one or two or three, sort of ahas or, shocking, things about the company that, you would like listeners to know about i3d.net.
Yeah. I'd mentioned earlier, I think what took me by most surprise was the, top 5 peered network in the world,
Yeah,
for
exactly.
this 200 person company in the Netherlands, right? Just kind of blew me away. And then if I could list the amount of video games that they've delivered, over the 2 decades, kind of like really blew me away. And, for me, obviously coming from the media and entertainment side, seeing how there was no real like effort, or sort of like drive yet to like start doing the same things for content and streaming and live production, and seeing the opportunity that existed for i3D to also operate in that space, and when I look at the speed and sort of the performance, because this was a video game company first, video game distribution company first, the focus on latency sensitivity and security, for DDoS was like an emphasis, and it's done really well for other players in the space, like, Discord, that was a prior customer of ours, and other folks that are doing things that are live. So for me, I'm excited to take this further. Like, IBC is going to be like my kind of first step back. It's been a couple of years to talk to folks and see like, well, what can we do? What problems can we solve together? What's something different we can tackle?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, I also chuckle a little bit because there's so much focus right now in live streaming on latency, latency. I don't want to, hear my neighbors cheering before I've seen the play, and I don't know, there can be some, debates or arguments about whether that's really a thing. Some people are sort of like, come on, when have you heard your neighbors cheering and, whatever. We won't get into that discussion. But, it is true. And I think nobody can argue that, look, streaming, if you're 45 seconds behind the broadcast or behind the terrestrial, well, that's probably not going to work in today's, in today's world, today's Twitter world where, even just the social networks, maybe you don't hear the neighbors, but you're going to get the X, alerts or whatever. But there are no more latency sensitive people on this planet than gamers. And if i3D for 20 years has been, meeting the needs and satisfying gamers, I think you're probably going to do okay with live streamers, is sort of the feeling. So I'm definitely with you on that one. Yeah. You mentioned IBC. And I think a good place to wrap up is kind of a two-part question. First part of the question is, what are you personally going to be tracking at IBC and, over the next, 6, 8, 9, 12 months? What are you personally tracking? And that's part one of the question. Part two of the question is, what is your advice for somebody who's running a platform? Maybe they're in the middle of a transformation. They've been mandated to cut cost and, so it means moving off a certain platform, moving on to another, or maybe they just know that they need to just modernize, they need to go from HD to 4K, or they need to do a better job of 4K, or, it means different things, right? For different people when you use the word modernize. But so the first part is, what are you tracking, in terms of just technologies, trends? What are you going to be looking at? And then what's your advice, for maybe how to get started for somebody who's like, hey, we have a network that was built basically 10, 12, 15 years ago. We need to modernize it. But gee, there's a lot of debt there, technical debt.
Yeah, on the tracking side, God, I'm going to tell you that as just fundamentally kind of like a nerd with tech, if I am afforded the time to spend as much time as I can, I try to go as the whole gamut, right? So it will be from things like talking to, storage and network hardware manufacturers and distribution guys and seeing what their roadmap is, the software play out production and seeing what they're doing with their things. And even though I'm not in that space anymore, it's gives me a good kind of pulse on where things are going at industry wise. And it's always good to just do that sort of temperature check from like an I3D strategic perspective. One of the things that I'm looking at is, tech and broadcast integration and ISVs. And how are they handling the challenge of like DORA and NIS2 and producing and distributing content in EU? And is there an opportunity for us to help some of those challenges? And I'm very curious because there's a lot of players here in EU like there are in North America that are outside of like the hyperscaler category.
Yeah.
That do a lot of different things. And,
Yeah.
for us, we have our own, unique selling proposition. And, I'd like to see like where there's alignment, and seeing how like we could solve problems together in the space.
That's awesome.
And it's natural because there isn't a real like clear cut solution out there right now. And I'd like to play a part in being like one of those voices that could step up and say like, yeah, we're doing something with NetInt, the quadra clusters and whatnot. Right. So that's a thing. And then when we're looking at folks to modernize, putting back my IT hat, right? I think I have to ask like fundamentally, what does the business need to run, today? And like, what is it that you need to operate and do your day to day? It goes without saying that, of course, like i3D has supported like workloads that we're migrating off of VMware. We're one of those guys, that are like, hey, yeah, we're an option for you, right?
Yeah.
But I think fundamentally everyone's business needs are going to defer. Yeah. And if you're running with like 5 years of tech debt, the bad news is like your supply chain is really bad right now. So you're probably looking at gray market stuff, The good news is there's a lot of great SaaS solutions out there that you can run with, that will probably be able to help you run your business without making a huge investment on like infrastructure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, good. Well, Ray, thank you for joining us. I do encourage all of the listeners, if you're going to be in Amsterdam, if you're going to be at IBC, make sure you stop by the VPU ecosystem booth, visit us, come, say hi to Ray, come learn about i3d.net, and our other partners are going to be there. One of the super interesting things about the VPU ecosystem is that, yes, there are going to be companies that on the surface look like they sort of do the same things, and, maybe they do, but most of the ecosystem works together. And it is absolutely astounding to me, how strong, how together these companies that have chosen to build on VPU are joining together and are really powering now some of the largest streaming systems on the planet. And, it's really been fun. Obviously there's some reward in that, there's some business benefit, of course, for everyone involved, but it's really been fun to see, this world, this category that didn't exist 6-7 years ago. It was just a twinkle in our eye. We were just starting to think about, what to call the category. And now, we're powering these massive workloads. So invite you to come meet Ray. Come, learn more about i3d.net. And if you're not going to be in Amsterdam, reach out. I know Ray's accessible on LinkedIn. I'm very accessible. We're always here to help make introductions to all of our guests. So don't be shy. Reach out. And until next time, Ray, as I like to end every one of our interviews, happy encoding.
Happy encoding, guys.